Namaste. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, grasshoppers. This is the third installment of our Cecil Purdy, the first world champion correspondence player from Australia, several times Australian champion and international master over the board, and the prolific author of many instructional books, including one of my favorites on the Fisher versus Spassky match. Perhaps we will cover that from his perspective at some point in the near future, as I hope to do the Fisher-Spassky match in its entirety at some point, as it was quite life-changing for me. In this particular game, Purdy, as unlike the previous two games where he was white, where he essayed e4, this is the year 1962. In the Australian Championship, 30 years after the previous games, he's playing the move d4. His opponent plays the rather universal move knight f6, and after e6, white has the standard pawn center of the queen's gambit, fighting for the center, as we've talked about. Black plays the amorphous e6, which is perhaps the number one choice of players today in entering almost any of these variations. And when Purdy plays the move knight to c3, I am quite surprised, but not so surprised given the time period, that black answers with d5, entering into the queen's gambit. And just as they would today, 9 times out of 10, players will essay the exchange variation followed by bishop to g5. Now, the number one reason why players choose the move order with knight f6 and e6 is so that if white chooses to play knight f3, then and only then will black play the move d5, avoiding the continuation that we are to see in this game. However, after the moves knight f6 and e6, when white plays c3, the highly recommended move and the great equalizer that most players are avoiding on the professional circuit today is the Nimzo Indian. This is absolutely the most reliable choice for black, the most solid choice for black, controlling the center, and Nimzovich would be very proud to know that his defense is keeping white and black from playing the opening in certain move orders. So for example, the move d5 is not played on move number 1 if black wishes to play the queen's gambit. They choose this move order. And when black chooses d5, we immediately go into the exchange variation. It should be noted that knight takes d5 was played by Fisher on a couple of occasions, with the intention that they were going to continue with c5. However, the lesser-known move, rook to b1, stops any counterplay with bishop to b4 check, or the recommended move in some repertoire books, a3, which to me is not as purposeful as rook to b1 to stop c takes d4, c takes d4, bishop to b4 check. Spassky actually chose the move knight f3 against Bobby Fischer, and after c takes d4, c takes d4, knight to c6 by Fischer, Spassky played the erroneous bishop to c4, and Fischer immediately hit him with the move b5, which could not be taken because of the fork on the bishop and the king. So therefore, today, however, most players, instead of knight to c6, play the move bishop to b4 check, aiming at further simplification. The semi-terrace is a very valid response, as was given credence by Magnus Carlsen recently. However, usually it's in answer to knight f3. For example, in this particular instance, after the move knight c3, black will now enter the semi-terrace defense without a bishop on g5, overworking the queen's defenses. Basically, after the move bishop to g5, black's queen is trying to defend both d5 and the knight on f6. So black's pawn structure on the king side could get crippled, and you will see this in 2 games between Lasker and Pillsbury from 1895 and 1904, respectively, approximately, or 1896 and 1904, 8 years apart. So as we already know, the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation is a very pleasant continuation for white. Black almost always responds with either bishop to e7 or c6 to defend the pawn on c5. Bishop to e7 is a little bit of a holdout in order to perhaps, if white were to play the move queen to c2, start slapping the center with c5. However, in today's game, Purdy plays very standardly with e3. And after the move c6, we return to the normal fold with bishop to d3. Now, simplification is the order of the day in many of the variations of the Queen's Gambit declined to try to hold absolute equality. It's a sign of respect if your opponent is trying to do such a thing. Although black usually castles in this particular position, might even throw in the move h6 and after bishop to h4. Only now might they consider moves like rook to e8 or knight to h5, seeking simplification without impairing our pawn structure, exchanging the dark squared bishops. Purdy's opponent, however, is a little bit more, let's just say, cooperative, as he plays the move knight to e4 straight away, allowing white the possibility of keeping the bishops on the board with bishop f4. Now, personally, while I would play bishop to f4, Purdy seems to be okay with the exchange of queens, and in fact with the isolation of or the fixing of black's pawn on e4 with the help of the pawn on e3 holding down the fort. Now, it's black's objective in this particular position to attack on the king side, while white's primary preoccupation might be to create a minority attack involving rook to b1, b5, b4, b4, b5, and you'll see this in the game. At this moment, after queen to c2 and f5, we have only a couple of choices really for white. There is one interesting possibility that pops up. So because there are 3 logical moves in this position, we will go for it with the candidate moves. Again, with the candidate move process, this is a standard process that you have to internalize, wherein you scoop up all of the good moves in the position at a glance. Now, the strongest of players are able to do this in relative microseconds, scooping up all the good moves, weeding it down to 2, and then doing and performing quick analysis, even in the most rapid of bullet games. Now, I don't recommend that anyone play true bullet. Personally, I think the fastest that any aspiring player should play is 2+1. And in that manner, you can still do the candidate move process of scooping up all of the good moves, whittling it down to 2, and with a cursory, hopefully accurate calculation technique, you can whittle it down to the best move. So among the 3 moves that you might write down in this position, you will compare them to find the good move, the better move, and hopefully the best move of those 3, circling the best move for your own personal entertainment. Now, our silicone friend points out that in this particular position, the move knight to d5 is extremely bothersome, taking advantage of the pin on the c file. Now, this move had not occurred to me. I unfortunately only had a choice between bringing a rook to the b or the d files and playing the move that Purdy plays in the game, knight on g to e2, in order to get castled. Black, of course, continues his development, preventing the aforementioned tactic that we talked about on d5, taking advantage of the unprotected bishop. And Purdy follows up by moving the same piece twice in the opening, tagging that pesky bishop, which should indeed move away. And also preventing knight h5 so that we might continue our kingside assault with moves like possibly g5. So in this particular position, Purdy's opponent goes for the rather cheesy plan of reaching the d3 square with knight to b4 while tagging the queen. So it's very standard to stop this in its tracks with a3. The knight reroutes itself toward the center with knight to c7. And herein lies the tale as we give ourselves a choice of candidate moves for white once again. There are several different pieces and a pawn that we could be moving in this position. Several different pieces and a pawn that we might be moving in this position. Honing this process towards light speed is akin to improving your serve in tennis. Basically, you want to start off slow, making certain that you place the serving ball into the box just on the just above and across the net. And you usually work on this serving process very slowly, working on accuracy, very slowly working on accuracy, and only after you start to attain accuracy can you add the speed. Hence, adding speed, i.e. being able to play faster time controls. But without that process being honed, it would be reckless of myself or any coach to allow students to play bullet or rapid chess without those key elements of choosing all of the candidate moves in the position, whittling them down to just one or two, comparing, calculating, assessing, comparing, calculating, assessing, and only then choosing the move that you'd like to play. And obviously Purdy could have castled queenside, which appears to be the best move in this position. After all, the knight is not very well placed, but to hold the center. The pawn move that we were discussing earlier was not the minority attack involving b4, b5, but instead securing the knight on f4 with the move h4. And lastly, possibly exchanging the knight for the bishop if we were not going to waste any time securing the safety of our knight by playing h4. Purdy chooses to castle the kingside, a natural move. And as we've often said, natural moves, when played without, unfortunately, the deep process of analysis, calculation, and all of that, can lead to natural disasters. Natural moves can often lead to natural disasters, and I've been the victim of many a natural disaster in my lifetime by playing what appears to be, because I've studied so many master games, I know what the natural move is in many positions, but even so, it gets me into horrendous trouble when I play a move without giving it accurate calculation. Another move in that position also might have been rook to c1, which also appears here, as Purdy does find the best move in this particular position, rook on f to c1, beginning a rather awesome and serious plan of occupy the c5 square with the knight possibly doubling up and only then trying to weaken the queenside squares with b4, b5. Now, Purdy is, since he castled kingside, struggling a little bit in this position. The position is roughly equal, very double-edged, as black can and should perhaps protect his bishop with bishop to f7 and threatened to play the move g5. Instead, black plays the rather natural move. Actually, this is a rather unnatural move, if you must know the truth. Rook on f to c8. Does not quite seem to me that black should be playing on the queen side in this position. He should be pushing pawns and storming the king side. And this gives white an opportunity to capture the bishop on e6, but it lets it slip for one more turn as he plays the natural move knight to a4. And when black plays the move knight to d5, finally challenging the knight on f4, white lops off black's seemingly not so valuable white squared bishop. But at the same time, he gets one more opportunity to increase the momentum that he has by playing the move queen to b3 and tagging the pawn on f7. Now, black does, interestingly enough, go for a rather ridiculous tactic. Black should just tuck his queen back to safety, both defending and attacking. With queen f7, because he's going to continue his assault. However, he plays for this rather ludicrous tactic, threatening knight to c2 check. Knight to e2 check, threatening the rook on c1 and the king on g1, while offering for a trade of queens. Now, interestingly enough, white plays for another overworking / overloading idea in this position instead of the correct move. The correct move, of course, is simply to exchange queens and continue on our merry way with knight to c5. And after the knight that takes the queen back on e6 recaptures, we will begin by doubling our rooks and pressuring on this file against the rook on c8. However, this tactic, while it looks pretty good, lends itself for Purdy to show his tactical nature by playing the move rook to c3, keeping up the pressure on b7, and black sort of falters and says, yeah, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, I was bluffing. Black does not have time, by the way, to be able to play knight to e2 check, because after king to e2, black's queen is still hanging on e6. So because the queen is hanging on e6 and the knight is hanging, queen takes b3 might be forced, and the knight on e2 is actually trapped, with the pawn on b7 still being in the lurch. So therefore, going back to rook to c3, black gives up on his folly of playing for knight to e2 check by playing knight to c3. Knight back to d5, theoretically attacking the rook on c3. And we will go for candidate moves for white once again in this position. What purposeful move can white play in this position? There are several. One or two that lead to an advantage. And, of course, one or two that may simply only equalize because the rook is being attacked on c3. For those of you joining the stream, I am FIDE trainer and National Master John MacArthur. I have been coaching, teaching, and training since 1984, and I have made all of the mistakes that your coaches are making now, as they are young. In fact, Grandmaster Joel Benjamin wanted me to write a book of my coaching experience and all the mistakes I have made over the years, that I have honed many national champions and at least one grandmaster among other titled players. We've been very lucky to have Brewington Hardaway graduate from our school. He left Columbia Grammar and Prep shortly after becoming a grandmaster, shortly around the time of becoming a grandmaster. I believe he's pursuing a homeschooling route. We've also had Grandmaster Hans Niemann. Currently, we have Tani. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name under the pressure of being tired. Tani, who has achieved the rating for International Master. So he is International Master-elect Tani. And International Master Nico Chasen, who has 2 GM norms, pursuing his 3rd at our school. So we have a vastly and wildly successful program, which I'm very happy to be a part of. The move in this particular case that Purdy plays is rook on A to C1. However, the better part of valor in this situation, if he really did indeed want to threaten the pawn on B7, was to alleviate the pin on the knight on D5 immediately and threaten to move his queen. Basically, you can't keep the pin and threaten the pawn at the same time. Knight to C5 immediately would have bothered the queen, but unfortunately only would have led to equality since the rook is still being attacked. And of course, black falters here once more. Just as he has maintained equality, he plays queen f7, allowing white quite a bit of leeway. There we see the remark toward the e6 square that I had made earlier when reviewing this game that held the pin in place. Now that the queen is protected, the knight is threatening the rook. The rook now does go back to c2, and once again, it is black's option to continue the attack on the king side, batten down the hatches on the queen side, and he should perhaps play rook to f8. Instead plays rook to c7, allowing the knight to occupy the c5 square. And now black brings the last worst placed piece into the game. After all, this is the key if we are trying to improve our position. And once again, with this pawn structure, we can see that we are trying our best to break through on the king side, while white is trying to create some form of counterplay on the queen side. So white's next move, while it may not be the best for equality, is a very logical move. White chooses to play the move queen to c4, clearing the path for the b pawn. And after rook on c to e7, white plays an extremely adventurous, embarks on an extremely adventurous continuation here. Candidate moves for white. Personally, despite being slightly worse in many variations here, I may continue to follow up with Purdy's plan, as I've held the status quo in many of my own games, by following up on my ideas regardless of the danger, which is always better than not following up. Oops, I apologize. I'm off by one move in my scorekeeping. Black first played the move g5, b4 was played, a6, and after queen to e2, rook on c to e7, this is where I was quizzing. I apologize. So for those of you that started on this particular position, suggestions and candidate moves for white. Sometimes it's just plain hard to admit that you've made a mistake in your strategic planning, which is what I believe Purdy falls for here. Again, candidate moves, part of the process, scooping up all the good moves in the position, comparing them, assessing them, calculating what's needed, comparing them, calculating what's needed, reassessing them. And that process has to be internalized and done over and over again. Now, the move that Purdy should do versus what he did do in this position is that he should probably backtrack a little bit with the move knight a4, with the idea of unseating white's well-placed knight on d5. Instead, he chooses to sacrifice the knight for seemingly what looks like 3 pawns. After all of the queenside pawns are in the lurch. So after knight takes b7, rook takes b7, rook takes c6, it appears as though he's about to realize his plan when his opponent throws in a rather reasonable looking defensive move, knight to c7. Black should, of course, just let him have that 3rd pawn and say, you have nothing. We're about to break through on the king side, and we are going to clobber you. But instead of that, black flinches. Chess is a lot like arm wrestling in many cases. You put pressure on your opponent, you keep putting pressure, and at some point they snap. That is not unlike what happens to Purdy's opponent here. In this particular instance, Purdy once again loads the cannon, as we saw in both of the previous games. I believe we saw it in the previous game as well, but we definitely saw it in the first game with Cohen loading the cannon on the c-file. And black should, like I said before, return the knight to d5 and press on with his attack with f4 instead of playing a rather passive move, tripling down on the defense of his knight with rook to e7, as white is still in the game after this. Had black played knight to d5, perhaps white would have experienced more than just a few technical difficulties. However, here, we're coming in with queen to c5. Black, again, is sort of pegged down to some rather passive thinking, as he just simply avoids what is going on with rook to d7, allowing white a semblance of Gegenspiel. Queen to e5, centralizing the queen, and although the pawn on d4 may not be advancing, in some lines it is a threat, since the knight cannot take after rook to c8 check. Black will lose material, so therefore if the rook takes, the knight on c7 will be in the lurch. So keep that in mind as white continues to play for more. Now, interestingly enough, this is an opportunity that white should not once again pass up. Candidate moves for white, everyone. Honing those skills. This is a YouTube instructional stream with GTS available there, and a subscriber only Twitch stream. As requested a long time ago by Ron Hay. Ladies and gentlemen, Ron Hay may not be here, but I'll say he is anyway in spirit. It is Ron Hay's birthday today. We did have a birthday arena for him, as I have a birthday arena for any strong player of note.
Polly
said QF6.
Queen f6 is a very reasonable try, sir. And like I said, you're allowed to carry 3 darts, a minimum of 3 darts. If I told you could throw 5 darts at a dartboard, you should.
R1C5.
Now he hits the nail on the head. Rook on 1 to c5 is the move that white should play
said
to keep the pressure.
R6C5.
We do want to improve our worst place piece, which is why we don't choose the rook on the 6th rank. Of your 3 choices, rook on 1 to c5 was hitting the nail on the head. But white still is battling being slightly worse after Purdy's second best move. Queen to g3. Now black, of course, should utilize the strength of his rook covering all these pawns on this side of the board and press on with f4. only because after e takes f4, he might continue to cause trouble with knight to e6. Oops, no. I apologize. So as it turns out, he doesn't play for such a move. And after the move, queen to g3. After the move, queen to g3. Instead, prepares with knight to e6, exactly what we were talking about, guarding the g5 pawn the old-fashioned way by protecting it. And finally, activating the knight, although, as he should have done a long time ago, yielding the pawn on a6. And now, black follows up rather energetically with h5. Yeehaw, right? And as we mentioned in the previous game, advances like this should and could be bet by h4, even though rook to c8 check is also a very good alternative. Black keeps pressing, as he should, and we already know what's going on here. After e takes f4, knight takes f4, we have to really avoid a very dangerous fork, a family fork on the e2 square, so king h2, a move I'd not normally quiz on. And of course, if knight e2, we will throw in, as well we should, rook to c8 check, and then we'll secure our queen from the g3 square from the clutches of the knight. Knight e2 is black's best chance. However, black gets a little bit greedy and tries to bring in a further attacker. And this leads and spells trouble. Candidate moves for white. Candidate moves for white. What do we do? Find candidate moves for white. What do we do? Find candidate moves for white. Now, Purdy does play the second best move in the position. The cursory analysis of this game thought that Purdy's move was a blunder, but it's really not that bad. When you do the cursory game analysis by anything.
RC8 QC3 RCC6.
Very good. Very good choices. But I would replace queen to c3. With queen to e3, honestly. And perhaps rook on c to c6. I'd replace with Purdy's move. Although rook to c5 is realistically also holding the balance. Purdy chose the second best move. Ace takes g5, while rook to c8 check is by far the best. Might as well get that move in. Might as well bother the king and activate both rooks on the 8th rank if needed. So after ace takes g5, this gives black an opportunity to make a mistake. So he is giving black a lot of room to trip up. And black in this particular position could barnacle with knight to e6. He doesn't do this though. Unfortunately, he continues tripling down on attacking white's queen. Candidate moves for white. There are only realistically 3 moves in this position that are good for white. Believe it or not, all 3 moves that one might think of are good for white. Previous candidate moves still apply, but there may be others. Namaste, Tactics Troop.
Tactics Troop.
Thank you for joining. the dojo. Namaste. As I mentioned before, the TTS is available for those on YouTube or for Twitch subscribers, for which this instructional stream and almost all instructional streams have been aimed at. I just have to remember to turn off the subscribers only chat for tomorrow morning's stream, which I've forgotten to do in the past for 2 days, in fact, and I have relative crowds and nobody's talking, which is very kind of the people to be so respectful to note that it's still subscribers only chat.
Said.
All right, that's what I was waiting for.
RA8 G6.
Excellent. G6, Rook C8 check, and Queen to H4 are the three best moves. Queen to H4 are the three options here. Rook to A8 check, unfortunately, does not necessarily activate our worst placed piece, which is on C1. So therefore, White does indeed choose the move Rook to C8 check, and after the move King to G7, Purdy does indeed follow up with the decisive idea of playing G6, threatening the queen. And of course, the rook will be hanging on G3 with the pawn threatening to promote on F7 after rook takes G3, G takes F7, and we can't extract both so easily from the position. I guess we can with rook takes G2 check, king to H1, king takes F7, but unfortunately rook to C7 check, king to the 8th rank, and rook to A8 will deliver mate. There's just no way to stop any of that with our king on the F file, since we can't run to the H file, so the rook on G2 can save us. So, the knight needs to take care of business, and we have candidate moves for white once again. What can we do here? There are, once again, several moves that look very, very good. Several moves that look very, very good. Two that are decisive advantages for white. Believe it or not, there are still two moves in this particular position that are decisive advantages for white. Candidate moves for white. We're way over our time here, by the way. Way, way, way over our time. I usually try to finish these within 30 minutes, but we're 10 minutes over the mark. But this game is worth it. Believe it or not, Purdy is slogging his way out of a worse position, showing his defensive skill. This is by far the best game of the three that we have seen so far, and Purdy has not been winning it handily until now.
Polly
Said. RC7 QC7 RXG6.
Wow, Paul 184 is on the ball. Queen C7 obviously needs to be played. Rook C7 would be a trade of queens. And after rook takes G6 check, queen takes G6. What were you planning next, Paul 184? I guess there are two correct moves. After rook takes G6, queen takes G6 that white could play.
Polly
Said. RG8.
Bing, go. Absolutely. After rook takes G6, which Purdy plays, there is, of course, the possibility of playing rook to C7 check, and after king H6, queen F4 check. Rook to G5, tries to avoid losing the queen or further things, but then queen to f8 check will lead to a decisive advantage. So rook to g8 check, however, is a much clearer method of taking advantage of the unprotected queen. And not only, I repeat, not only are we bothering the king and scarfing another pawn, but we are also threatening to win material in other ways, thereby saving our pawn on a3. In fact, the queen and the two passed pawns on the queen side are going to decide the game. And it is at this moment, after rook on b to d7, that black realizes the danger he's in and resigns. After all, white can simply just start pushing the pawn. The king is quite safe, but the two rooks are finding it very difficult to coordinate themselves against the advancement of these pawns. And if at any of these moments the two rooks are not coordinated, they will be picked off by a series of checks. Basically, let's just imagine for a moment that we play rook to d4, b6, and rook takes a3, attempting to get behind the pawns, then queen. And of course, we don't wish to allow queen to e5 check. So if we try king to h7 check, avoiding queen to e5 check, the only drawback is that queen to e7 check picks off the rook on a3. And the pawn, once again, continues to march through. So the game did end here. Whether black lose it, or whether black lost on time in this Australian Championship of 1962. It's quite amazing how the longevity of Cecil Purdy. It's also possible that he chose to resign straight away after queen to e8 check. Queen takes e4 if he thought that was one of the reasons why he had no hope, because yet another passed pawn enters the picture. I do need to thank everyone for being here. Namaste, Nefsaron. Great win against me this morning. Nefsaron knows that I've been up for a very long time. I want to thank you for being here. This is a subscribers only chat on...
Said. Bye, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I don't think that I'm going to do a fourth instructional stream for today after my daily stream this morning, which is roughly an hour and a half or so, maybe less than 2 hours, and the 2 or 3 instructional streams here. We are going to raid someone new. One of those mighty new candidate masters. We'll see what happens. Thank you, everyone. Just making sure that they are up and running. Thank you for the follow, Nestron. I hope I see you in the morning. If you've not yet joined the dojo, you may find the dojo here. You may find me on all of my socials. I am Master Chess Dojo on all of the socials. And of course, you'll be able to find my TikTok reels, Instagram reels, YouTube short reels on YouTube, and at all as Master Chess Dojo. Thank you all and have a good night. I'm going to sign off here officially from New York City. This is probably my last raid of another channel for the day. Cheers and ciao. Nestron, thank you very much. Paul 184, thank you very much. Infirmum, thank you so much. Tactics Troop, thank you for the follow. Cheers and ciao.